The Health Fix podcast teaches you how to take charge of your health naturally by giving you the information you need to elevate your health.
Hello there, health junkies. Welcome to another episode of The Health Fix. I'm your host, Dr. Janine Kraus. Today, I'm interviewing Veronique Mead. She's a former family physician and assistant professor turned trauma therapist who now integrates the research showing how adverse life events affect risk for chronic illness, why it's not psychological, and what you can do about it. Veronique never realized that she'd experienced adversity until she left medical practice, retrained as a trauma therapist, and discovered how adverse life experiences affect health. Today, we're going to talk about the impact adverse life experiences have on your genes, the nervous system, the cell danger response, and more. Veronique, welcome to the Health Fix.
Thanks so much, Janine. It's great to be here.
So today we're going to talk a lot about something that is near and dear to my heart because I see so many patients that come to me that say, Doc, I went to see my primary care doc and I've been to multiple specialists and they're telling me my fatigue is in my head, that I created this problem myself and I can't figure out how I created this problem. And you know, that alone is stressful. And I know that you have quite a story that goes along and mimics a lot of what I'm hearing in my office. Do you mind sharing a little bit about what brought you to be an advocate for how life's adverse events lead to chronic illness?
Absolutely. When I was a family physician 20 years ago, I started getting tired myself, and it came in what I would call bursts, like fatigue attacks is what I'd call them. I'd be totally fine one day, and then the next day I was so exhausted it was hard to roll over in bed at night, which, you know, that's mind-boggling if you've been healthy your whole life. And I, as a physician, I really began to think, you know, well, let me rule out the major things. Let me make sure it's not a blood sugar problem. Let me make sure it's not my thyroid. Let me make sure there's not some other weird thing going on. And I checked a few basic labs and everything was, as those of us with chronic fatigue know, they were all normal. All the basic stuff was normal. And as I kept thinking about it, I ended up joining the faculty in New Hampshire, and I was working 60, 70, 80 hours a week, and my fatigue got just gradually worse. And I finally started thinking, you know, this has got to be stress related. And I ended up leaving medicine, not because of the fatigue, but because I just felt that I and we in medicine were really missing something. I didn't know what it was exactly, but there was something in my soul that something didn't feel like I was doing what was the most helpful. So I left and took a year off thinking, okay, reduce the stress, reduce what's triggering all this, and I'll get better. And I actually got worse instead. And a lot of listeners will relate to this. You know, we hear about what can trigger the onset of a chronic illness. And for many, many people with all kinds of chronic diseases, it's an infection, not just chronic fatigue onset, but people who have diabetes will often develop it after an infection or other autoimmune diseases. And then you treat the infection and it doesn't go away. Your illness, the chronic fatigue or the whatever it is you have, doesn't go away. So here I'd completely taken a sabbatical. I was completely slowed down and I got worse. And I ended up getting worse over a period of about 10 years, very, very gradual. And I also ended up during that time going back to school and retraining as a somatic trauma therapist, meaning that I was listening to what the body has to say and thinking about what's the intelligence that's going on? Is my system trying to communicate something to me? And what I learned about trauma when I was at school, it was a psychotherapy program. So I was learning about how trauma is the risk factor for not just PTSD, but depression, anxiety, other mental health conditions. And what I got curious about was, If trauma, first of all, I learned how much more subtle it is than we ever think. We tend to think this is about war or abuse, and it only happens to maybe soldiers, or people who have experienced the worst, most atrocious things. But the definition of trauma is actually anything that to you as an individual has some degree of overwhelm so that you are unable to escape it or overcome it. It's really that simple. And so a lot of us have had experiences in childhood, throughout our lives, that have had some degree of too much, and that have actually gotten our systems into fight, flight, or freeze. We don't talk about freeze a whole lot, but we've actually gone into places of numbness or disconnection or fatigue. And this happens in a lot of chronic diseases. But so what I was learning about trauma made me wonder, is there any chance trauma is a risk factor for chronic disease? And so I have been exploring the research that's already out there for the past 20 years, and it's been mind-boggling how much is out there showing that adverse life experiences actually influence it's not a psychological thing. It's actually changing our physiology and how our genes function. We finally, in the past 5-10 years, have started to get the level of research that's explaining and showing us how this is happening. And so that completely shifted how I started thinking about chronic disease. And I've ended up developing a different model, a different way of thinking about it. And there are others doing that as well, so that it's all starting to come together into this new paradigm about chronic illness. And the best thing is that there's more reversibility than we've realized. And so in my own story, and I share it on the blog in more detail, but in my own story, I got gradually worse for 10 years. And as I was discovering all this, I then started implementing things, working with trauma I never thought I'd experienced or never realized had happened to me. Very subtle stuff, nothing major in my own history. And I gradually started coming out of my chronic fatigue. And it's been a very slow process, but I was mostly bedridden, mostly horizontal, housebound for about 9 months at my worst. And I am able to do so many of the things that are part of normal life again. I can take long walks. I can go for hikes. I can run errands. I don't have to worry about how many spoons I'm using, which a lot of listeners will be familiar with that expression.
Yes, I do know about the spoonies.
Yeah.
Oh, man. So it seems, what you're talking about for a lot of people, this is not uncommon. I mean, I hear this quite often in my practice, and to hear that it's taken you time to recover is a good thing to hear. And I think it's a good thing for a lot of folks to hear, not because I want people to have to take time to recover and whatnot, but it's because I think a lot of us are looking at this concept of quick medicine. Doc, there's something wrong with me. Why can't you fix it quick? Yeah. And sometimes we have to put in a little bit of our own effort to pay attention to what's going on.
Yeah. And that's part of, I think, this new paradigm. It's a revolution in a way. And it's ultimately empowering, because the things that we start to learn and the process we start to go through when we look at our own illness and our own process, and we start listening to our own bodies, it actually helps us become more of who we are underneath the layers that we may have had to develop to survive our worlds. And so it's actually life-changing. It can be very hard work, for sure. And you hear about people who have had an overnight cure, but it's so not common. And it makes us feel like we're failing if we do the same thing those folks did with their same illness as ours and we don't get better. But I think that's part of this new paradigm as we start to learn more from this perspective. One of my big ahas, there were many, but one of them was that there's actually a lag time between sort of the initiation of the changes in our physiology that eventually can lead to having a chronic illness. For example, people with the autoimmune form of diabetes, type 1 diabetes, will have antibodies for 10, 12, 15 years before they actually ever develop the disease. And not everyone who has antibodies will ever develop type 1 diabetes. In fact, for some people who have antibodies, those antibodies will actually reverse and resolve and go away. Which, I mean, I never heard about that as a physician. And part of that's because it's relatively new research in the past 20 years as we started to be able to track antibodies more deeply. But it's one of those really helpful things from autoimmune diseases and antibodies is that it's starting to shed light on the fact that it can take a very long time to recover from a chronic illness because it's actually been a process that's been evolving for a very long time also underneath the surface.
I love that you mentioned that because that's something that I think a lot of us feel like it just happened. I just started to get tired.
Yes.
Why shouldn't I be able to turn this around right now? Or for my type A folks who are high achievers who end up becoming fatigued, they're like, I've figured out everything else in my life. Why can't I figure out this thing?
Tell me about it. I'm one of those.
I think it's more common. Honestly, I think it's more common for, I would say probably at least 75% of my patients that have chronic fatigue are still, let's put it that way, are still overachievers, but, things compounded for them.
Yes.
And I think this is a great time for us to chat a little bit about this. The concept of trauma is not stress. They're completely different things. And I'd love for you to kind of speak on that a little bit, if you will, the difference between those two, because I think I made the choice to talk a lot about little traumas as if they're little bears coming after us, and they're stressors. But I was reading in some of your material that trauma and stress are very different. So I want to hear a little bit from you in terms of the difference and how we can think about these things differently.
That's great, because this is really a crucial question. Trauma, well, let's start with stress. We're all so familiar with this concept of stress that it's something that if you look at it from a pure definition, when I was writing my thesis, the purest definition was anything that asks your body or physiology to adapt is a stressor. So it could be if you're cold, you need to put on a sweater. That's an adaptation to a stressor so that you can then be warm. And then when you deal with the stressor, the adaptations resolve and your system returns to baseline. If you've got a stressful period at work, your system might get a bit geared up and hypervigilant. Maybe you have trouble sleeping and your gut goes off and you get other symptoms. But then as soon as that period's over, your system is designed to recover, come back to baseline, sleep returns. That's what we all understand as health. And that's, as I see it, the definition of stress. When the stressor goes away, if your system's in health, then your body will go back to being able to adapt and adjust and be healthy. The thing about trauma is it's an event that takes you beyond your capacity to cope, beyond your physiology's capacity to cope, or your emotional capacity to cope. It puts you outside of the range of what we tend to think of as a fight-flight response. That's where the hypervigilance and the trouble sleeping and that not being able to slow down and that restlessness can come from. Trauma takes us past that because you can't fight your way or run away from some threats. The virus that's going on, the whole pandemic, is not something we can escape from. And having to hunker down and essentially kind of freeze in place because it's an invisible threat we can't fight, that whole bear thing, that actually takes our system into more of a freeze response. And the freeze response has other qualities. It can help us become numb. and disconnected, so that in the wild, the way this was designed is so that when the cheetah captures the antelope goes into freeze after running at that full speed. And that helps it not feel pain. There can be a euphoric feeling, but it's actually something really protective. And there's videos of this online. If by some chance the cheetah isn't that hungry, is catching this to show her cubs how to do this, is going to bring the antelope home, or maybe gets distracted because the hyenas come up on her. If that cheetah gets distracted, this freeze state in the antelope is actually covering over an intense state of fight flight. She was just running at 50 or 60 miles an hour, and all of a sudden now she looks death-like. This is actually a physiological response. This is not a conscious response. And this, I'll talk more about this for chronic fatigue in a minute, but in that state in nature, if the cheetah gets distracted long enough, that animal's system can shift back into her fight-flight mode, and then she can go from 0 to 60 in no time flat.
Wow.
And escape.
Wow.
So there's all these layers of freeze that are designed to actually help us survive something that's too much to escape or survive in the moment. And then if we do escape, if that antelope escapes, she uses up all this stored up, pent up adrenaline and all this energy and sugar and what's going on in her body during fight flight. And it conveys a signal to the brain, to the nervous system, that it's over, she's safe, she survived, and now she can go back on with her life.
Wow.
So this thing about trauma, what happens for us as humans is, if we experience something beyond that level of stress, something at enough of an overwhelm that we actually can't escape it. And this is a common example here is when we talk about abuse in children who can't escape, can't fight the adult. But it can also happen in an accident. It happens too fast, you can't get out of the way. And so we end up going into that freeze state, not out of conscious choice. It's something our body takes over, makes it happen really fast. It's outside of consciousness. And if we aren't able to come out of that freeze, our nervous system never gets the message that it's over. And that's how you start to think about trauma. Trauma is something that took you beyond fight and flight, that you couldn't escape or fight off using the standard fight flight, and that your system had to go into some form of shutdown. And if your system doesn't do the traditional things to come out of shutdown, it can often involve things like shaking or trembling or crying, and it could be even much more subtle than that. And that's something we tend to block. If you've been in an accident and the police officer comes and you have to write a report, it interrupts those. Or in childhood, if this is some kind of threat that you're experiencing over a long period of time, weeks, months, years, all of these things strengthen the freeze response. And then that's where you mentioned the cell danger response at the beginning.
Yes.
That's one place where the science is shown and where he's writing about this theory. If you can't convey to your nervous system that the threat is over, our systems can get stuck in a defense response, in a survival response.
I see. Okay. So
that is what leads eventually to symptoms. If your system is caught in, let's say, freeze, if it's caught in this place that you don't even know is happening, then over time, anything that may sort of remind your nervous system about that original threat, or that stimulates a new sense of threat in your system, can trigger that pathway that's gotten initiated by the trauma. So it may strengthen the pathway in your system, a nervous system pathway, a physiology pathway. It might be in your blood pressure, how it reacts. It might be in that you might go numb a little bit or get a little fuzzy-brained when you get stressed. That's how the path can get strengthened over time. And eventually, this is what happens over those years as the antibodies are forming. At least that's how I'm seeing it and how a lot of the research I'm looking at is seeing it.
I can agree. I can agree. It seems, in patients that I've been practicing for 13 years now, and in some of my original patients back from when I was practicing in Colorado, I am still seeing them online, and I'm seeing this kind of thing evolve. And it's kind of wild to have seen folks for over a decade now, and you're going, oh my gosh, I can see how this whole process evolves, and I'm feeling terrible because I am not stopping it.
Right. And that's part of it, is that on one hand, in medicine, in our healthcare training of all kinds of healthcare professionals, this is not yet part of our training. We still tend to think mind and body are separate. So the research on trauma and the fact that it influences the physiology has not made it into training yet. Mm-hmm. And so we tend to think that it only causes mental health conditions. But even in the mental health world, it hasn't reached it really yet in training. And so we are caught with this societal cultural view that if we're sick, if our symptoms are progressing or worsening, that there's something we're not doing right and that it's our fault and that maybe we're weak or that we've caused this or brought this on ourselves. That's really common. And it's a huge challenge that people are facing if they have a chronic illness and they have a history of trauma and they're starting to think, oh, I wonder if the fact that these things happened in the past have any influence, but does that mean it's in my head? Does that mean it's psychological? And that's what the research is showing, that actually not mental health isn't psychological either. It's a unconscious process happening in all these nervous system pathways that are not something we're choosing. It's a survival response that's happening underneath the surface.
Wow. And so this is where it takes us to conditions like Hashimoto's thyroiditis and chronic fatigue and IBS.
And IBD, inflammatory bowel disease too. All of these diseases that every time I look at a new disease, I go into the research wondering, is there any evidence that trauma might be playing a role? And every time I look, the amount of data is actually kind of overwhelming. It's sobering how much there is. And I talked a little bit about freeze and chronic fatigue, and we were talking about stress and trauma. And I want to add another piece, which is that trauma is what initiates the pathway. And this, you mentioned the cell danger response. So that's the work of Dr. Robert Navio, who is at UC San Diego in a metabolics lab that he runs. And he actually did a study on people with chronic fatigue. And I'm just going to see, I had some of that information. I just wanted to see I got my numbers correct, because this was one of the few hard evidence studies also from this perspective. And so what they did, he studied a total of 84 people. They looked at 600 metabolites from 63 different biochemical pathways to see, are there any common things? Are there any differences between those with chronic fatigue? There were like 45 people with chronic fatigue, and then the other 44 folks were healthy people. And are there any differences between these two people in their metabolic pathways? And it turns out that 20 of those pathways were very different and had abnormalities. And that in chronic fatigue, 80% of those abnormalities were in the direction of that freeze state.
Wow.
That's a lot. 80% of those abnormal pathways were in the direction of freeze, which is the hibernation state.
Yeah. Wow. And so that, I mean, when we look at freeze state, I'm looking at we are metabolically shutting things down. We're going to have a lowered thyroid function.
Right.
We're going to have lowered ability to make energy. We're going to have lowered ability to probably detox as well.
Exactly. And your system is going to shift into how it uses fuel and how it tries to preserve energy and conserve energy. And the metabolic pathways that Navio's group found were the same pathways you find in a research animal, a research worm called C. elegans. The worm is used in a lot of research, all kinds of research. And those metabolic pathways are seen when that worm has to go into a shutdown state because it's in a situation of overwhelming threat. And for the worm, that could be that there's not enough oxygen, or that it's too warm, or that it's too dry and there's no water, it's too cold. Whatever those things are, it's not a threat, it can escape. And so it goes into a shutdown hibernation-like state to wait out until the conditions change.
Wow. So perhaps a lot of people who are seeing worsening of their symptoms of chronic fatigue and hypothyroidism, and the only reason I keep putting the hypothyroidism back in again is because the fatigue goes along hand in hand with it, folks, just in case you're wondering why I keep saying that. So folks are basically waiting. Their bodies are stuck waiting for some type of signal that says it's all good, all clear.
Nicely put. Yeah, that's a really nice way of putting it. And so there are three things about the cell danger response theory, and he's written a few papers on this. There are three things that I find especially helpful for people with chronic diseases. And he's done this research in chronic fatigue, but he's also applying this to 100 of the most common diseases: autoimmune diseases, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, the thyroid diseases of overactive and underactive. All of these, he's looking at it from the same viewpoint. The first point is that the cell danger response, the CDR, is what the cell does when it gets overwhelmed by a threat. It's an intelligent response. It's not an accident. It's not an error. It's not a mistake. It's actually a unconscious pathway that goes into shutdown as a survival response. So it's actually intelligent. That's the first major point that I find really helpful about the CDR as he talks about it. The second is that symptoms come from this shutdown state being stuck in the shutdown permanently until that signal comes. And so it's the stuckness of that survival response that drives symptoms. Again, not because it's a mistake or a genetic defect. It's because of this natural, normal, intelligent response getting stuck in the on position. Mm-hmm. And then the third thing is that all of this suggests the potential for reversibility. If we can get those signals through to the nervous system or to the cell itself, because it can happen at all these different levels, and the system can recognize that they're no longer under threat when that's what the conditions are, then the system can revert back to its ability to adapt in the moment.
Wow. So then the question becomes, which I'm sure a lot of people are going, okay, great. Tell me, how do I do that? I want to know right now, which wish we knew exactly, of course, no magic here. But it sounds like with some work. So do you mind sharing with us a little bit of some of the stuff you were mentioning in terms of identifying triggers, things that may keep you in the freeze state? Is what I was kind of gathering. Tell me if I'm incorrect in terms of gathering information from you, that triggers that go out through life can keep you in the freeze state?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that's where we come back to the difference between stress and trauma. In Navio's research, when he surveyed these people in his groups, what he found was that folks who developed the chronic fatigue had kind of a certain group of different risk factors that threw them into the illness, or that revealed or that triggered the onset of the illness. And so infections were one of these. And it's not just one kind of infection. All kinds of infections, viral infections, bacterial infections. It was not a specific infection that threw different people into the same disease. And this was a major point. Different triggers, same disease. Huh. A second form of trigger so infections are like biological. Mm-hmm. There were chemical toxins, things like the toxins from mold. That's a huge trigger for some people.
Sure.
And then there was psychological trauma. And so that could be something like losing a loved one, or getting fired from your career, your job. It could be that you've been a caregiver for a long time. And so these psychological traumas, they can actually be stressors. They don't have to be traumas, because they're like the last straw instead of the actual cause. They're the last straw during that long period of time where that pathway has been evolving, and suddenly this one more thing throws that system where that pathway kind of becomes the predominant pathway. And then there's physical trauma. So accidents, injuries, illness, those can also kind of be the last drop that throws our system into overwhelm, into that survival pathway. So anything that is sort of asking our system to adapt, that's a stressor. Mm-hmm. Anything that fits that category of stressor can actually make our pathways get stronger. Now, these things are we just don't even think about what they might be. They become things we're not even aware of. They're everyday things. So as an example, for me, I developed food sensitivities over time. A lot of people with all kinds of different chronic illnesses develop sensitivities to different foods. And for me, it just started off with dessert and vinegar, like salad dressing. And my mom's, she makes a homemade ketchup that I love. You eat it with meat and potatoes. It's like a chutney, really, really good. And then desserts, which I love. I have a big sweet tooth. And those would throw my system off. I'd either have an energy dip, or I'd get a dry mouth, dry eyes. And it was really hard with willpower to stay away from those. But over the years, my sensitivities got progressively stronger, to the point where years into this, I actually changed my diet because I had so many symptoms. Not just dry mouth and dry eyes, but then I started having restless legs and constipation, quite severe. And so the symptoms just kept getting worse. Mm-hmm. Finally changed my diet, got very, very clean, took out all the carbs, all the bread and pasta and cereals and legumes. And after 2 years on that diet, a lot of symptoms had calmed down. So this is one way of working with things. You're actually decreasing the stressful input to your system, the things that may trigger inflammation, but also things that may stimulate something other than a healthy response, like a little bit of fight flight. I would have a spike, an energy spike up after sugar, that sort of chaotic, wild, racing a little bit. Having a fight flight, that's a little bit of a fight flight response. That can actually trigger more freeze if your system's in a freeze response. Anything that makes your system want to mobilize, move, do a little bit can actually make that freeze state hunker down even more, because your nervous system sees it as more threat. Therefore, we need to shut down even further. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it actually does. I'm thinking about many patients with their sweet tooth, but I'm also thinking about the case in which folks try to do some of these crazy workouts, like the HIIT style workouts where they're jumping all over the place, or CrossFit for that example. And they're like, I can't get through a workout.
Right. Right. And so that's an example of a stressor that seems completely normal, even healthy, which for many people, it's totally healthy to do a workout. But if you have a system with a survival pathway that's geared in a particular direction, either it's geared towards freeze or fight flight, then certain things that stimulate that same healthy, normal pathway, like going into that mobilized place that increases your blood pressure and heart rate and body temperature in a healthy, normal way, that's still the same pathway as the fight-flight pathway. And so if you have a body organized around the survival response of shutting down as an intelligent survival response to things that happened in the past, and it's stuck there, then anything that tries to take it out, that tries to make it move out, go into fight flight, can actually trigger that freeze response to become stronger. So that's where with chronic fatigue, we have to titrate. We have to go really small when we are starting to try anything that involves movement, for example, whether it's taking a walk or just getting out of your bed and going to the bathroom. Depending on how severe your chronic fatigue is, it takes less and less and less of these little stressors to make that freeze response and the chronic fatigue stronger.
And that's what I've seen. That's what I've seen in my office. That's one of the big, stressors that, frustrators of the patient too, is because I'm gaining weight, I can't move, I can't exercise. And then it seems to be like this downward spiral of lots of other things that come as a response of not being able to move.
Yes. And that's also where sometimes in our best of intentions, whether as the person with the illness or as healthcare providers, when we try things out, vitamin B12, for example, things that seem really innocuous and they make us worse. Sometimes it's because our systems are actually so sensitive that they're responding again with more of that freeze response instead of using it as a way out. And none of these things are conscious. This is part of how this paradigm is shifting how we look at things, seeing that these are intelligent responses. It's just that they're no longer adaptive. And so, I wanted to say a couple other things about the risk factors. The cell danger response is what's happening at a cellular level. It doesn't have to go all the way to the nervous system. It may happen in a certain tissue. It may happen in if you've had an injury in some part of your body, it may be that part, your wrist or your hand doesn't move as well, or that there's some numbness. Some of it can be because of the nerves that were damaged directly from a cut. But it may be that limb isn't quite as mobile as it was before. Even if it's not where the injury was, that can be a freeze response in a tissue. It can be, so it can happen at all these different levels.
Wow.
I am just working on a blog post about trauma and Parkinson's disease, and it's often happened, and the literature has a lot of this showing that the first symptoms of Parkinson's often seem to start in a limb that was injured in the past, or on the side of the body where there's been an injury in the past. And so this is another way of thinking about the freeze response. There's all these different kinds of freeze that will show up in different ways in our physiology. I think the same thing can happen for the fight-flight end of the spectrum. So we can get stuck, our bodies can get stuck in fight-flight mode. So that would be the high blood pressure, maybe the high thyroid, maybe the weight loss, maybe the diarrhea end of the spectrum, or we can bounce back and forth between those two. And so what we're learning about trauma theory and from adverse life experiences is that it doesn't matter what the threat is, whether it's psychological or physical, or if it's biological like an infection. It's when it comes upon a system that's maxed out or that gets maxed out by the experience that it can trigger the onset of an illness, because these pathways have been developing for years, if not decades. And in my training, we've long thought about chronic illnesses as stemming from an underlying genetic risk. But what the research in epigenetics is starting to show, epigenetics is where molecules get attached to the genes and then tell them whether to turn on or off. It tells them how to function. We're learning that at least half of what causes chronic illnesses have to do with the environment, things like adverse life experiences, because those may actually be required to turn those genes on or off and put us at risk. Even Huntington's disease doesn't happen at the same age for everybody. Even that appears to be influenced. And Huntington's is a genetic disease. So that's another place where we're starting to learn that it's not all about genes, and what's happening in our lives influences our health. And therefore, ultimately, I think the reason why we're talking like this today is that this means that we have more control and more possibilities of what we can do to influence our health than if it was all about genes.
Which is amazing, and which puts the power and empowerment back in everyone.
It does. It's not a quick fix, like you say. It's not linear. It's different for everyone. But as we start to understand how our own symptoms might get triggered and strengthened over time, it gives us an awareness to then start looking at how do we start to undo that? How do we send the signals to help the system shift? And that's what people who are in this model, looking at chronic illness from a trauma and nervous system perspective, are actually doing, that's helping them start to improve or stabilize or slow the worsening or recover. And that's what I've been doing for the past 20 years that's helped my system come out. I've been able to watch it in the most minute details. And it's not because it's in our heads. It's because we're conveying different information to the nervous system so that it can start loosening that pathway that's stuck in survival response and start shifting back to what our systems are designed to do, which is adapting moment to moment to what's needed.
I love that. I love that just analogy, just in general, getting us out of being stuck, getting us back to adapting so we can get back to homeostasis kind of processes. Now, if you don't mind sharing a little bit, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about perhaps a few things. You know, a lot of times I tell folks who are listening to my podcast, you know, here's one thing you can do, you know, after this podcast to start to help yourself in this aspect. What I'm thinking is maybe we need a couple things, and perhaps because this is such a huge topic. I mean, it's so huge, and my heart goes out to all of my patients when I'm sitting there going like, okay, I got to find something, you know, and I'm grasping for straws. We're grasping for straws, trying to figure out, you know, what is going to be that one thing that starts to get us change. And obviously I don't expect you to, you know, give us everything that, you know, has worked for you, because I know everyone's individual. But if someone's trying to explore their triggers and trying to explore what their nervous system might respond to start getting out of stuck frozen mode, what would you say? What could be some things that perhaps would be like level of priority? What would you start with, and maybe like 2 secondary things, something like that?
Well, I just wrote a blog post last week. If people were to Google my blog, Chronic Illness Trauma Studies, and Google the word comfort, I'm writing about comfort as one of these tools. It's like what my own system, when I listen to my system, this is one of the tools, is listening. What my system craves so much right now is comfort. And the thing about these tools is that they seem so simple that we want to blow them off. But if there was one thing I would work on with all the little examples, I'll give you some examples, and there's some in the blog post as well. It's that something like what is comforting to you, not to your friend or your spouse or your child, but to you specifically, that begins to convey safety to your system. And that's what we're actually, when you look at all these different things that you might do for your system, if you can start to think about what helps you feel one iota of safety in this moment, then what you're doing is you're providing different information to your nervous system than the old pattern that's kind of trying to run things. So, for example, right now while I'm talking to you, I'm sitting on a chair and I have a blanket that I put in that chair this morning because it was a bit cool. And it's really fluffy on the inside and it's super, super soft on the outside. And so it's doing a few things. One is it's just touching the softness of it. I'm doing that right now. And as I do that right now, something in my chest just settled. It sort of like moved downward just a little bit. And my hand, I have my left hand on it, and I'm just kind of squishing around the softness. And it's like my hand feels, it's not just the warmth from the blanket, but there's something cozy about that sensation.
I love that. As you said, I'm like, oh, that sounds lovely. I have my dog curled around my feet now, and he feels cozy to me and comforting to me. Little paws around my foot.
Oh, what's your dog's name?
His name is Brian.
Hi, Brian. Oh, that's so great. Yes, someone I was emailing with recently talked about getting home from the grocery store, opening the door, and her 2 kittens greeted her. And her whole system shifted from, it's stressful these days going to the grocery store. And she saw her kittens, and it was like a signal to her system. It's like, oh yeah, I'm home. I'm safe. And so this is an example of just 3 examples right there of what's comforting that's different for each one of us, right?
I love it.
This is actually conveying something to the nervous system. My hand that's holding the blanket is actually getting hot right now. And I'm actually getting some tingling going down my legs. These are little itty bitty indicators of what's called discharge in the trauma field. It's either neutral or pleasurable. In this case, for me, both of these feel good. They feel pleasurable. And it's actually a way that we're thawing a little bit of that freeze response in the most gentle way possible. We're not forcing anything. We're not trying to make anything happen. We're just kind of allowing a little bit of that sensation. And so I'm not doing this from a cognitive decision to feel safe. I'm actually doing something like, oh, what feels comforting to me right now in this moment? And it's like, oh, this blanket has been like my best friend for the past weeks,
Nice. I think that's important. I think it's important to recognize these things because I think one of the things that I can't speak on personally, I'm a fur baby mom. I'm not a mom. But what I see from a lot of folks is that they put their comfort behind the comfort of their children, the comfort of their husband, the comfort of their family members. Same thing goes for caregivers. And I think this might be one of those things which a lot of people will overlook in terms of their own health and in terms of what they crave. Because I think when I ask people what do they crave, the first thing they tell me is food stuff. And I'm like, no. What do you really want? Like if you could do anything right now,
Yes.
kind of things.
And I want to make a link to this because when we talk about adverse childhood experiences, adverse life experiences, we tend to think it's only the big stuff that happened to other people. This concept of comfort and of taking care of others first actually very frequently especially with folks with chronic illnesses, chronic symptoms, chronic mental health conditions, very frequently in their childhoods, these are people who had at some level to take care of others over their own needs. Maybe they had to be a really good kid so that they didn't upset their parents who were really stressed out, or so that they didn't have an angry lashing back response from a parent. Or maybe they had to get good grades so that they didn't get blamed about the report card. Or maybe they had to do some of the housework or extra work or come home alone to an empty house because their parents had to work extra jobs just to keep, things afloat. But very, very often, this craving for something like comfort comes in from a very tender place that's actually an adverse life experience. That's actually something that in our early lives conveyed to our systems that it was not okay to be who we are, that it was not okay to have needs, even little needs, to have needs for comfort or to be comforted, let alone to be comforted emotionally. And so what this highlights really about this seemingly tiny little exercise is that it's a big deal. When you are paying attention to something as simple as what is comforting to you in this moment, you're actually being quite subversive. You are changing a pathway that helped you survive something in the past that was the only way you could survive it back then. And it wasn't a conscious choice. It might have felt that way, but it was a nervous system response when there was nothing else that could be done differently. And so this can get belittled or seen as weak or seen as too little for something as big as my very serious disabling chronic illness, which is very real, but it is actually committing like an act of treason. You are telling that freeze state that it is no longer needed, and I am taking in this ounce of comfort to remind and tell my system that actually right now, today, as an adult, sitting in this chair, there is some safety right in this moment. And I have more tingling going down my legs just saying that.
I'm tingling. I'm like, that's powerful information right there, to the point where I'm like, you know what? This is what folks need to hear. And I think this is where we need to give folks more information on how to find you and how they can read that comfort blog post, because that is a great post, by the way. I did read that one actually last night, in fact. So I think, folks, you got to go check out Veronique's blog, chronicillnesstraumastudies.com. And she's got great links to cell danger response. She's got links for chronic fatigue, articles, research. She has so much information on her website. You will be busy for days and weeks. But it will help you to understand that even though we're not recommending a supplement or a pill or a medication, there are things you can do that are way more powerful than that. And look, just by talking about comfort, Veronique's getting tingling. I even am like, wow, I feel this just as much just from experiencing. She got me to kind of experience my dog wrapped around my feet here. And it's something that I love, the concept of connecting to yourself. I love the concept of going back in and taking a look within. And I think this is a perfect place to sum up this podcast, folks. Go work on what makes you comfortable. And then we're going to have you go over to cell danger response. That's what you want to click on, chronicillnesstraumastudies.com. And also Veronique is going to supply us with a PDF on It's All in Your Head. And this is a PDF on the silent epidemic of what probably a lot of you have been hearing about. Like, no, that's not really happening. It's all in your head. Your fatigue's in your head. Go home, figure it out. As you listen to our podcast today, that's not the case. And I really hope that you guys gained some information. If nothing else, go out and make yourself comfortable, whatever it is, to find comfort today. Veronique, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, Janine. It's been a pleasure.
Hey, Health Junkies, Dr. Janine Krause here. I hope you enjoyed my podcast. Guess what? I have a Facebook group. It's called Anti-Aging Health Tips with Dr. Janine Krause. So if you want a little bit more of the Health Fix podcast, head over to my Facebook group and let's chat. Now, I'm also offering a health transformation and restoration program. It's a one-on-one with me. And it's for folks who are sick and tired of going to doc after doc and health coach after health coach and not seeing the results that they want and deserve. In my program, I'm working with folks with transformation. So this isn't just a light program. This is a big deal. I'm going to change how you think about your health and your life kind of program. And I'm super excited to offer it to folks. And if you are at all interested, we should talk. I'm offering 45 minutes free with me chatting to see if and how I can help you. And you can get all the details over at my website, drjkraussend.com. All right. You've survived another episode of The Health Fix. I'm your host, Dr. Janine Krause. Have a great day, whatever you're doing.
Subscribe, rate, and share info.